The Law and You, a look at laws in St. Vincent and the Grenadines which affect our daily lives. The Law and You, presented by lawyer panel P.R Campbell QC and brought to you on SVG-TV as a public service.
Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, boys and girls, greetings. Welcome to another presentation in this public service nation-building series, The Law and You. This is program number 919. And it is coming to you on Monday the 5th of November 2018. On this program, I will speak to you on the topic life interests. But before getting into the topic, a few preliminary comments. Firstly, and as usual, I would like to send out my deepest condolences to all families which have suffered recent bereavements. Secondly, this being the 5th of November is what is known as Guy Fawkes Night, Guy Fawkes Day, commemorating the attempt by certain rebels headed by Guy Fawkes to blow up the British Houses of Parliament way back when, but the plot was discovered before the gunpowder barrels that were set underneath the House of Commons exploded. We know it as the bamboo joint season. Thirdly, tomorrow is an extremely important day in the history of the United States of America and indeed in the history of the world, because tomorrow will be the occasion for the holding of what are called the midterm elections in the United States of America. Midterm meaning it comes in the middle of every presidential term of 4 years. So every 2 years, right in the middle of a presidential term, elections are held for a certain number of seats in the House of Representatives, the lower house in the United States governmental system, and a certain number of seats, roughly a third of the United States House of Senate, and many positions of governors and other lesser positions are up for decision by the people of the United States of America. Those who have been following politics in the United States through the news media, I should say, would have observed that since President Trump took office, certain drastic changes have taken place in the United States of America, and in particular in the foreign policy of the U.S. Tomorrow is seen as a referendum on the Trump presidency. And according to how the people of the United States vote, the future of the United States would be shaped, and indeed the future of the world. I will say no more at this time except to ask the Lord to let the people be wise in their decision making. Excuse me. I go on to the topic for the evening, life interests. A life interest arises when a person is given ownership of property, real property, for that person's lifetime. It is to be distinguished from other forms of tenure, such as absolute ownership. Therefore, if parents decide to give their property to children, or to anybody for that matter, subject to the life interests of the parents, it means that the parents continue to own the property until they die. Now, that kind of ownership, where you own a property for your lifetime, is to be distinguished from absolute ownership. If you have absolute ownership over a certain bit of property, it means it's yours to do with as you please. If you absolutely own something, you have a title deed for it, you can sell it, you can mortgage it, you can exchange it, you can give it away, because then it is yours and yours alone. But if what you have in property is a life interest, the property is not yours to do as you please. You can't sell it. You can mortgage a life interest, but very few financial establishments would give out a mortgage on a life interest, because if you have a life interest in property, when you die, you no longer have an interest in the property. But theoretically, according to the law of the land law, you can mortgage a life interest, but that is seldom to be entertained. A person who has a life interest in property is called in law the life tenant. Tenant in that context has nothing to do with paying rent. Usually the word tenant comes up in discussion of landlord and tenant, somebody who rents a place and the person becomes the tenant of the owner or the person from whom he or she is renting. That's one kind of tenancy. But in law, in land law, tenancy refers to the holding of an interest in real property. Therefore, a person with a life interest is called a life tenant. Nothing to do with collecting rent. And the person to whom the property reverts, or the person who gets the property on the death of the life tenant, is called in law the remainder man, even if the person is a woman. It's still known as the remainder man. Therefore, a gift from a parent to a child, let me simplify it. It's a one parent to one child, assuming that parent owns the property. Let us suppose father and mother have a property in which they live as a matrimonial home. Father dies, and the property becomes, by dint of the holding, assuming they held as joint tenants, the property becomes that of the mother alone. Okay, so the mother owns the property outright. She decides to give the property to a daughter, but with the reservation of a life interest. That is, she gives it to the daughter subject to the life interest of the mother. And you would recall on several programs in the past, I have advised parents that if you are giving the home in which you live to any of your children or several of your children, make sure the lawyer puts in a lifetime interest for you, that's the same as a life interest, so that they can't throw you out of the property while you're still alive. And I have known cases, sadly, where parents have given property to their children on the expectation that the children would look after them until the parents die, only to find that after some time, the children send them off to the Lewis Panett home and hardly visits them. And they die in grief and sometimes misery. So I have said in the past, if you are going to give the property in which you live, make sure you keep a lifetime interest in that property so that until you die, you can live there. If you have several properties and you say you live in one and you rent out the others, well, then you could always give away those that you're renting out because you're not dependent on those properties as a place of abode where you live. But if you live in your home, don't give it away to any child without putting in that deed of gift that you reserve a life interest. And I will tell you now what that life interest entails. If you have a life interest in the property, it means that it is not theirs until you die, because you have your lifetime in it. If you can't remember the word life interest, tell the lawyer you want your lifetime, and that is more understandable. So in a sense, it is a future gift, but you do it now and you register a deed of gift to a child and you keep your life interest. It means that you are still the owner of the property in terms of the right to live there. And if it is a property that earns an income, you have the right to that income as a life tenant, having a life interest, because not only is it where you live or yours until you die, but the proceeds, anything that comes from the property, becomes yours until you die. When you die, who you gave it to can then physically possess it. Of course, you can make whatever arrangements you want. For example, if you have a commercial property and you want to give it to anybody, offspring or whatever, you can always put in the document that you have your life interest in it, but they have the right to the income generated by that commercial property. Nothing is wrong with that, but that would be a specific agreement which you make with the person to whom you are giving the property, reflected in the deed by an appropriate clause drafted by the lawyer who prepares that deed. Now, it clearly follows that if you are selling property, you can't sell something to somebody with a reservation of a life interest. But you can sell property and say to the person, look, I want to be able to dwell in that property until I die. And there's nothing wrong with somebody buying something from you subject to a clause saying that you will live there till you die. Any income generated by that property belongs to the person to whom the property is sold. So that one normally finds life interests arising in gifts and seldom in outright sales, because if you buy a property You want to live there. But I've known cases where you buy a property consisting of a two-story house, you have a very small family, you buy it from an elderly person, the elderly person really has no other way, no place else to go and live. So you can always say to the elderly person, look, I'm buying this property from you, but I will allow you to live in the downstairs till you die. Of course, the sale price would be adjusted to take into account that arrangement. So that specific arrangement can be built into the deed by which the property is sold. And you go and live in the upstairs. You have the old person from whom you bought living in the downstairs, and when they die, you take over. So that arrangement is possible, but it has to be specifically worded. But generally, a life interest means you have your lifetime in the property. Nobody can put you out against your will. Property cannot be sold against your will, or even if it is sold, the person who buys it cannot take possession until you are dead, because you have your lifetime in the property. You see, the law makes allowances for a multiplicity of human situations. And a lot depends on how the deed is worded. Therefore, the drafting of deeds where there are special arrangements is something which has to be done extremely carefully. Sometimes the drafting leaves room for conjecture. It is a bit ambiguous, not clear, and the conflict results, has to go to court for the judge to decide what the words in the document mean. And there are several techniques of interpretation by which the court is assisted in arriving at the true interpretation, or as lawyers put it, the true construction of the document in question. There are certain responsibilities resting on the shoulders of those who have life interests in property. One of the responsibilities the law imposes: if you have a life interest in property, you have a legal duty to take reasonable care of the property while you enjoy your life interest. You cannot allow the property to become so run down, not by normal wear and tear, but by extraordinary wear and tear. And the person who is the remainder man, that is the person who gets the property when you die, has a legal right to go to court and compel you to take care of the property if you're not taking care of it during the time you have a life interest in it. For example, if the galvanized on the roof start deteriorating and the roof becomes termite infested, the remainder man can ask you, look, I want permission to repair this house. After all, I have an interest in the house because it will come to me when you die, and I don't want it to become so run down that by the time you die, I get a property which is practically worthless and I have to rebuild. And if you refuse, the remainder man can actually take you to court for willful refusal to permit him to maintain the property in an appropriate state of repair. So that as a life tenant, you're not free to do as you please in terms of the quality, nature, and value of the property. Repairs, you're expected to carry out normal repairs. Now, if on the other hand, you want to do alterations to the property, then you have to get permission from the remainder man if those alterations are significant enough to change the character and value of the property. So as a life tenant, you can't say, look, you're altering the property and you start to pull down walls and rebuild and so on in a way that reduces the property in either its nature or its value. The remainder man can go to court and stop you doing that. In other words, you are not permitted to do things which adversely affect the interest of the remainder man unless they are absolutely necessary to your enjoyment of the property. For example, if there's something which the property needs to make it more comfortable for you to live in, or to reduce discomfort, you can say to the remainder man, look, I am thinking of doing so and so. What do you think? If the remainder man objects and you have a conflict, you want to do it, the remainder man says no. That's what the courts are there for. You go to court. Each will put his side of the case to the judge, and the judge will decide on whose side justice lies. And the judge could either compel the life tenant to do or not to do certain things, just as the judge has the right to compel the remainder man to do or not to do certain things. So that what the law attempts to do in those cases is to strike a balance based on fairness, justice, reasonableness, so that the life interest that the person has becomes meaningful and is not permitted to become meaningless, just as the life tenant cannot do to the property that which diminishes its value unreasonably, making it less attractive for the remainder man when the time comes. Now, because we don't know for certainty when death will step in, the length of a life interest cannot be accurately predicted unless you have a terminal illness and the doctor gives you X number of months or years to live in. But of course, even doctors can just make a prediction based on medical science. Sometimes people live much longer than what the doctors predict. Sometimes they die in a shorter time. So that life interests are uncertain. Now you may ask finally, what happens if the remainder man dies before the person with a life interest? Well then, the beneficiaries of the estate of the remainder man will then inherit the property on the death of the life tenant. So you have a life interest in the property. Property has been given to X, subject to your life interest. X dies before you. X's estate, that is his beneficiaries, inherit the right to get the property from you when you die. Very fascinating topic, but one which calls for the exercise of good faith on all sides The lieutenant has to show good faith, and the remainder man also is required to demonstrate good faith. I hope you have understood a little better now the question of life interest or lifetime in property and so on. But as usual, in cases of conflict, you seek legal advice bright and early. Don't act first and then go to a lawyer afterwards. Seek legal advice first, whether you're lieutenant or remainder man. If there's a problem which cannot be resolved by both of you discussing it, seek legal advice and take the appropriate action before it becomes too late. Remember, it is always much more expensive, much more time consuming, much more stressful to go to court with a problem than to have it resolved by listening to legal advice. If you're not sure about the advice you get from one lawyer, there's nothing wrong with going to a second lawyer or even a third one if you have the money to get proper advice and be guided accordingly. Okay? All right, well, that is all from this program of the Law New, program number 919. I look forward to being a further service to you next week, Monday, Day, for another presentation in this public service nation-building series, The Law and You. Sister Jocelyn and Mother Map, I hope you are both resting comfortably from your various ailments. And until then, may the good Lord bless us all, and may He continue to bless all of us, and may He especially bless the people of the United States of America and guide them in the casting of their votes tomorrow.
The Law and You, a look at laws in St. Vincent and the Grenadines which affect our daily lives. The Law and You, presented by lawyer panel P.R Campbell QC and brought to you on SVG-TV as a public service.